and you can start talking. And I heard a lot of people, it sounded like a good number of people have actually made it through the implementing a notes into some of the other sections, like styling and deleting sections even. Is that right? That's awesome. For those of us who were in implementing a notes, did people feel like it would be useful to walk through that section, the rest of that section today again? I think we can probably make it through the rest of implementing a notes application. Sorry, I've been a little under the weather too, so I may be a little slow today. So I think basically at the end of the last class, we were at this point, we generated some IDs and stuff, but we hadn't yet implemented any of the stuff around adding a new note to the application, right? So that I think that's where we can sort of kick off from, if you want, this adding new notes to the application and how that will work. And this will be a good opportunity for us to talk about a few different things, such as they introduce a new way of defining a React component, which is the class-based model here. And we can talk about the difference between the functional components and class components and how some of that works. Does that make sense for everyone? For a place to start? All right. And help me if I ramble, though, like I said, a little under the weather. So we'll see where we go. Oh, I had one last thing I wanted to touch on, because this was going back to what Alex was asking about last time. She had some issues with the debugging, and I talked about logging. So the other thing that he showed in the tutorial or whatever up before this was putting in a debugger statement. So I'll give you an example of that. And I'm not going to give a whole class here on how to use the debugger in Chrome, at least not in this class, because that could easily be more than a class. That could be like, you know, several weeks of explanation. But at the most basic level, what you could do is, now I've already changed my app here over to use this class notation in a render. So it makes it a little easier for me because I have a place I can put the debugger statement. But anywhere where you can add an actual statement, you could do something like this debugger line. Oh, yes, I forgot. One of the problems with this is there's some ESLint. So linting is a way, there's a lint tool integrated into this project. And linting isn't something that is required. It's something that checks for what might be common mistakes or helps protect you from things that are valid in the language, but probably not what you intended to do. And so there's a linter already enabled in this project with some settings. And so it's a little annoying that he sort of suggests you can put this debugger statement in, but then if you do, you're going to run into this error saying you're not allowed to have it because of linting. So I might give some instructions on how to change this linting file in the future, but the most basic thing you can do, it's using something called ESLint. So you can search up ESLint and look at how to disable it in different ways, and you can totally disable it for a file like this. But you can also disable a given rule, like say a no alert rule, by putting in a special comment in your code. So if we go back and look at what happened here, let me zoom in a little bit so it's easier for everyone to see. We can see that it says the no debugger rule is what caused our problem, but we want to be able to put debugger in there. So I'm going to add just the comment here that ESLint disable no debugger, because I want to be able to use debugging statements here. And that should allow it to compile and get past that error now. And so now if we go and look at what actually happened, we get something really cool in terms of our application, which is it ran the code, and the minute it hit this line of code that was our debugger statement, it actually pauses the program there And now you can step through the code sort of line by line and see what's going on inside of your debugger in Chrome. And this is where, like I said, you could do a whole series of classes on how to debug using this debugger tool. And we may give some basic introduction to it. But at this point, there's a ton of stuff that you could do. You could, for example, pull up your console and you can see any variables that exist right now on this object. So this dot like props, you could see the props on this component. Well, it doesn't have any. You know, you can just look at this component as a whole and see everything about it. It's got props and state, except that's null, and a lot of other sort of extra things. If I pass values into this render function, you could even see what those properties were and look at them live while you're running. And you can actually, if you get really interested in what's going on behind the scenes, and there's a ton of stuff going on, you can step through codes line by line of what the JavaScript interpreter is actually doing. So you can see it says if you hit F11, it'll step through that function call. So on a Mac, that's like function F11, I believe. And oh, maybe it'll just do it with F11. We'll see. Nope. Okay, fine, don't. I'll just click this. And we're going to step down, like, if you're watching what's going on here, we're stepping down into like the React source code that's behind us, that's doing all sorts of complex rendering and processing, setting all sorts of values. You can step through every layer of this code. So you can begin to see just how much is happening behind the scenes that you don't even know is going on. You can step back up layers to like the level you were at, or you can just tell it to resume running. So if you're really having trouble with a component, with a function, something just isn't working the way you want, and maybe you're like your console log statements aren't enough for you to debug it and figure out what's going on. If you want to, you can set that debugger line in that file or in that function, and it will pause your code right there, and you'd be able to investigate it in much more detail as to what's going on in your code. Now, this is a really advanced debugging tool. It's not something that you use first when you're sort of learning how to debug, but if you really want to learn powerful debugging options, it's really useful to do. And we'll be covering a lot more ways to debug code over time in this class, just because you'll run into different issues. I'm going to get rid of that for now, because I don't want my code to pause every time it runs right there at the debugging statement. And we'll go back to sort of the state that we were at. So let's talk about adding new notes to the list. Here it has us add this app layer. We want to talk about adding new notes. So we add this extra layer in, and then we add a plus button that can trigger something. So were there any questions or anything that wasn't clear about being able to add this sort of button, so that when you click it, it triggers this add note? Or is that portion relatively clear? Does it seem relatively clear? Because basically all it's doing, right? A button is an actual component for HTML, and then onClick is an event. So when it gets clicked, it's going to run this function right here. Are we good with that, or confusion? Yeah. I feel like a lot of people might be stuck on different things. Maybe we need to take a break and work through some different sections that people are having issues with. No? All right. right, so I'm going to assume that like the on-click bit, that was pretty easy for people. Confusing. And it just fires that event every time you click it. So you can see here it's just incrementing this count because nothing else has happened in between. And I'm clicking it quickly enough. So now let's talk about the change that we had to make to actually push this data into the app. What they mentioned was, all right, we need to change our app, and we change our notes to now take this notes property instead of having the notes directly inside of them. That should look similar to what we did when we did the first React tutorial through this stuff, right? We're just adding a property, and then that can be accessed. Now, this may look a little different, though. You're saying, wait a minute, when we did the React tutorial, we accessed those things using this.props. And in this, it just accessed it using this really weird notation, parentheses notes in the function handle. Did that confuse anybody in terms of being new or different from what you were used to? We can talk through that if you want, or feel comfortable with it. We can skip over. Anybody want to talk through what's going on with that? Yeah? Okay, so this is another little bit of a shorthand, a new thing in ECMAScript 6. Of the idea of React in terms of why we don't have a props and ECMAScript 6. So we'll talk about function components in just a minute, but this sort of syntax right here is a default dereferencing capability that exists in the newer versions of JavaScript or whatever. So I think it'll work inside of our node environment. Let's find out. If we have our JavaScript read-eval print loop, let's create an object. We'll call it hero. And we're going to add some properties to it. Hero dot name equals, I don't know, Batman. And hero dot real name equals Batman. No, Bruce Wayne. Hero dot brand equals DC. Say, I don't know. So we've got an object now with a few properties on it. I don't know if this syntax will work right here. If not, I'll have to show you this elsewhere. But sometimes what you want are just one or two of those properties instead of everything on it. Right? Like, oh, I just want to print off the names of people. So how can I get, like, if I wanted to have a different variable, let's call it just name, var name equals, and we want it to be the real name of our hero. How could I do that? Hero.real name, right? Really easy. And then name, do that. There is another syntax you can use for some of that. Syntax, and some people really like it. So if I wanted to do something like that, I could instead do, I don't know if it'll work with var. I'm going to do const just for let, just to be sure. So let's say I want the real name from him. Did not work. All right. So I don't think that syntax is going to work in here. Let me try something here. VM. What am I using? All right. what do I have? NVM use 4.0. So now if I fire up Node here, I think it might work. Let's try. Object hero.realName. When I think this will work in this environment. We will find out. So this is a newer feature of JavaScript or ECMAScript 6, and it's known as, I'm going to get the term wrong here, but it's essentially a dereferencing capability. What you'll notice here is I didn't tell it what to put in this variable over here, this real name variable, but it got the real name. So what it did, other languages call this pattern matching. So Elixir, which is a different programming language, has something very similar. What's actually happening here is it looked at this hero object. It saw that it had a real name property and that I was trying to create a variable named real name. And it said, oh, I should put the value of real name into this new real name variable. So it's a dereferencing capability. So pulling stuff off of that hero object without having to explicitly type out like hero.realName. So it's just a little bit of a syntactic sugar shorthand. It would be the same as if I had done except it was, a little easier in some sense. And it gets even easier if I wanted to create more than one. This is where it gets sort of crazy. Like I could do real name and then name equals hero. Oh, it's upset because I've already declared real name. So it's not going to work that way. So I'll have to do it this. I can do brand because I haven't declared brand yet. And so now I have a variable called brand and a variable called name, and it pulled those properties off of my hero object and put them into those. This is, like I said, a newer item that you'll see in ECMAScript 6 or the newest version of JavaScript. And so given that, if you guys were to look at this line of code here, this function invocation, can anyone try and take a guess at what they think is going on with this bit of sort of the function name here? So let's say, if you will, imagine that instead of this function took a props property. It just called it props. So it's going to look the same. UL, blah, right? UL. It's going to look the same, but it took props as its property, right? And let's say that props property has a notes key on it, right? It's an object, and one of the things that it has are notes. So this is a lot of shorthand again. So if we rewrote this in a different way, you could say, well, this is a function. It's going to take a props property. We want to return this guy here. Let me tab this in, etc. And let's say this props maps to the same idea of the React props, this dot props that we're used to for our other React classes that we've written. And we know that app.jsx, when it calls notes, it passes in a notes property. So if we wanted to get that notes property off of our props, we could do let notes equal props.notes. A little closer to what you guys feel comfortable with traditionally, right? Okay, we passed in a properties object, a props object, and that has a notes property on it. So we're just going to assign that. And this should still work. This is that cycle of make a small change, test to make sure it works. Make a small change, test to make sure it works. So does that make sense to people generally? There may still be a question about why is this props property there? Why isn't it this dot props like it was on our React example that we did before? For now, just accept that. I'll cover that again in just a moment when I talk about functional components versus class components. Does that feel more comfortable to people? Yes, no? A little bit better? So then let's instead convert this into this shorter syntax, this newer ES6 syntax. So if I want to create this notes variable, I can be lazier here and shorten it to read like this so I don't have to repeat sort of that notes name. Because all it's doing is looking at this props object, it sees that it has a notes property and it assigns it into this notes variable. And so I save that and we can look and see, yep, that's still working.
Why is there curly braces around?
Why are there curly braces around the notes variable?
Why can't you just have it?
You can't, because then it's a little weird, but this is the syntax to denote, to dereference, to pull these of it, because otherwise this would look like, if I did it this way, we're familiar with this would be assigning the props object into a notes object. So it's just assigning it directly into this. This is a syntax to sort of say like, oh, I've actually got an object over here and I want to pull something out. The syntax is a little weird. It takes some getting used to. But that's sort of what's going on. You know, if you want to rewrite it, like I said, like the way we had it here, that's what we feel more comfortable with. Yeah, this is just the way that you can, the JavaScript knows, oh, I'm trying to do this dereferencing type stuff, pull these things off, this pattern matching behavior. Does that make sense? So that's, all right, now we can pull the notes off that way. Well, now we can be even lazier, if you will. And we say, oh man, I don't even want to have this separate line here. That's a lot of work. I know I'm passing in a props object here. I know that's what this is going to be. Whatever the first parameter to this thing is, the props object. So what if instead of even doing that, I just said, okay, whatever the first object, the first parameter passed in here is, just get the notes property out of it and create a variable for that instead. So I've basically taken this bit of code here and moved it up into my function declaration because, again, I'm a lazy programmer and I care less about clarity than I do about typing fewer keystrokes. Attacks that they had before for creating the notes, right? Now I'm going to revert this back to this syntax because I feel like this is clearer while still trying to introduce this new syntax and use this right now myself. But you can see the difference there or whatever about what we're doing. Another cool thing is this actually also exists for arrays. In a weird way, there's some interesting stuff you can do with some of this syntax with ES 2016, and so if we encounter that in this tutorial, I'll show you guys. If not, you can ask me about it later, and we can go over some of that as well if that interests you. Yeah.
When you use that syntax in the curly braces, it has to be spelled as an object.
It does for the most part. Now I'm going to screw up the syntax. I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong because I never remember how to do this without testing it. Yes, it does, unless you tell it otherwise. So let's go ahead and bring this back up, right? Let's create our hero again. Do we want to have a different hero? Who should we have this time? Pretty different? Superman. All right. What's his real name? Somebody said Kal-El. I'm gonna give him an alien name. And his brand is DC2, right? You need to give it the same name because that's how it can find it, right? But you can tell it. You can sort of say like, oh, this is what you're looking for, but I want to name it something different. So again, I'm going to screw the syntax up probably, but we'll try it. So let's see if I can get this. So let's say I want, we'll call it a secret identity. I may have this backwards, so there's a syntax you can use. Yep, got it backwards. All right, so let's try that again. Like I said, for some reason, I always get this the wrong way. So there's a syntax you can use that basically says, okay, you're looking for real name, but I want to assign it to the variable secret identity instead. So that's the syntax that says, get the, I had a better pointer in here today. Get the real name property off of this hero object, but assign it to the variable secret identity. Right. Now at that point, you're not really gaining much out of using this syntax over having set var secret identity equals hero.realName. But that's sort of the way you can do that. Is that clear? Yeah. So like I said, there's a lot of concepts is introducing that we didn't really go over too much because they're not fundamentally new concepts in terms of programming. They're just shorter ways to do things, a new syntax, something like that. They're nothing new, like classes were new to us or objects or arrays when we took our class.
Hey, Jared.
Yeah.
Some probably unapplicable question here, but let's say you're, writing the new Facebook and you've got a function that's called millions and millions of times. Do any of these dereferencing, does that affect performance at all, or is it fairly neutral?
I have no clue.
Okay. I don't think it would. But
I mean, it should.
Has been added any extra, overhead for processing speed or anything, but.
I think right now, assuming browsers don't still support it, Babel's going to convert it to this other syntax, right? Like this, when it actually runs inside of your browser, like if we were to, if you guys haven't checked out something like this, it's sort of interesting. If you go to like the Babel site, which is what's being used for a browser, it actually lets you right here sort of play with some JavaScript and see what comes out. So if we did var, I'm going to inline all of this to be really lazy, real name equals, and here I'm going to create an object with real name of Clark Kent. This is showing you on the other side, it's showing you what the actual output is for your browser. So you can see it's creating a real name variable with underscore real name and assigning it this object. And then it's creating a real name variable without the underscore and assigning it real name dot real name. So in that case, you shouldn't see performance difference because it converts it to the same thing. But that is a good question. Some of the newer ES like 6 features or 2015 features, some of them are slower right now in browsers than the older syntaxes. But some of them also, even though they're slower now, they're saying as the browser optimizes for that, it's going to speed up. So some of them are going to be slower and some are going to end up being faster than other approaches. So are people okay with this so far? That sort of syntax, it's a little new, it's a little weird, I understand. This took me a long time. So this was like several weeks of me writing this stuff before I even started to feel comfortable with it. So I gave you guys 15 minutes. Probably not as comfortable. So the next thing we get into is this idea of being able to push state to the app, right? We want to push state to our app so that we can change something, but it's telling you you can't do that right now, and we need to change some properties to be able to do that. So let's start looking at what some of our challenges are, and this is, I think, a time to talk about the way we've been writing these React components up until now. Is we've been using what React calls the functional component model. So all that means is we're writing simple, pure functions. It's the same as, you know, any other function that we've written in class, where we've written, right, var add, or I can even just write it this way, function add num1, num2, and then that just returns num1 plus num2. So that's what we've been writing so far, except we've been using this newer, shorter function syntax. And the nice thing about functional components, that's sort of the same way for this add function is, all right, I just wrote this simple add function. If I always pass in the same numbers to this, I'm always going to get the same value out, right? If I pass in 1 and 2, I'm always going to get 3 out. And that's because there's no other state. The result of this function is purely determined based off the inputs. So the output only depends on what we put into it, right? That's nice and clean and easy. Now imagine, if you will, let's create a variable. We'll use my favorite, foo, and we're going to make this an object. And we're going to give a number to it. We'll put a number on it of like 42, right? So foo has some value here. So now let's, I'm going to create a new function. Add to num. Add to foo, let's say, and I'm going to pass a number in, and then here I'm going to return foo dot num plus the number I passed in. If I called add to foo with 5, 47, right? 42 plus 5 is 47. So the difference between this function and our add function, can anyone tell me what the difference is between these two? Just any difference you notice at all. It doesn't matter. I mean, one of them takes one parameter, the other one takes two, right? Any other differences?
The second function uses a variable outside of its scope, like local scope.
The second one uses something outside of its local scope, right? And that's useful to think about. So what happens if I do foo.num equals 5, and now I call add to foo 5? What do you think the result will be now? Anyone else? Any guesses? 10. And that makes sense, right? Because it looks at foo.number right now and it says, oh, that's 5, so 5 plus 5 is 10. But the result of that now means that the add to, or not that, but the result is this add to foo function, it's not pure in the sense that its output isn't based purely on the arguments that it takes in as inputs. There's something outside of it that can change the result of it, right? And that's not necessarily bad. It's just something to know about when you're working on any given function, right? A pure function is easy to reason about. This one's a little harder, but it gives you some nice benefits, right? Like, look, I didn't have to change anything inside of my function to change results. That can be nice as well. That's both a plus and a minus. Does that idea, just the idea of pure versus impure, make sense a little bit here? Yeah? So this is, the reason I'm boiling it down to this is the concept or the difference between these functional components and creating a class, right? We're used to creating objects, and objects have state. We've worked with that, the state of objects, where if we change a property on an object and an object has a method, that could change the result of evaluating that method, right? And now that we're talking about wanting to be able to add items to our notes, we need some way to store that state that we're going to add in, right? Because we're adding stuff to it. The way that we have this working right now is it's pure. Not this one, because it depends on something external to himself. It depends on this, right? But we wrote our notes in such a way that this is pure. It only depends on the properties passed in, and then the output won't change as long as we pass in the same properties. There's no dependency on some other variable somewhere. Yeah, it calls some other functions, like create notes up here, but none of those have state either that are changing their output. Does that idea make sense? The idea of it being pure in the sense that whatever we pass in, like, it'll always give the same output for those results. There's not some other state that changes that affects that. But somewhere in our application now that we're talking about adding new notes, we need to hold on to this state. So that means somewhere needs to have state that can change and changes the result of outputting it. And so right now, we have that sitting here at this app.jsx level. That's sort of why this was created, is somewhere needs to hold on to this state. And what the class sort of has you do at this point, talked about pushing state to the app, and it says, what we'd like to do is just do something like this notes.push, right? So let's try that real fast. And I wrote this out a little different than they did. Is this large enough for everyone to see, by the way? Yeah. So I wrote this out a little different than they did in the book, just so that we can try some of this stuff easily, right? What happens if when we click the add note button, you'll see here my on click, I'm calling this dot add note. And right now all it was doing was console.logging. But let's go ahead and push an extra note into our notes array, right? So that's just pushing another object into our notes array. And if we want to, we can always break this down, right? Bar new note equals our object that we're creating. Again, I do like to break stuff down this much because I think working with smaller items is just better versus inlining it all. Yeah, it means I have to create an extra variable here, but it also means I get a reason about something in a much smaller size, right? I only have to think about creating an object here, and then here I only have to think about pushing something onto the end of my array. I'm not thinking about both creating an object and pushing it on. So let's say we have this. It should know what's going to happen when I click my button here is it calls add. We see it running because it's firing that add note console log, but nothing's changing here, right? And the reason for that right now is because of the way React works. React calls this render function only when new data, when whatever is rendering app, which is right here in the index.jsx, re-renders to re-render that app. But there's nothing in index.jsx that's re-rendering. So our app isn't re-rendering either, which means that it doesn't run through its render function. So it didn't call notes again and pass in the new value for notes or anything like that. So it's not going to know, oh, I need to change, I need to re-render, unless we tell it it needs to re-render. So at this point, the book introduces the idea of state and managing it through state and everything. But we have one more step that we could take before that if we want to. Because we are changing, let's test real fast. Let's see if we're changing our notes. Console.log notes.length. I'll even be lazier, or I'll put some more information here. The number of notes is notes.length, right? So let's log this each time. So now let's say I click this. It tells me we have 3 notes, we have 4 notes, we have 5 notes. So we're changing our array, we're adding stuff to it, but it's not re-rendering at this point. And that's just because React doesn't automatically re-render when one of those other values changes. It doesn't know that it needs to do that. But maybe we can find a way to do that. So I'm going to go over to the React documentation here. And I recommend people, take chances to read through this stuff. It may not all make sense at first, but you might learn things and get to experiment with something new, right? And because these are components or whatever, like this is a component, you can see it's extending React.component, and this is what's known as a functional component as well. But I'm going to focus on this app.jsx one. So since this is extending React.component, I'm going to look at the documentation for React.component. I guess I did make one other change. I changed this over to the class syntax, right? So now we should look similar to what you guys were doing in the React tutorial that you did before, right? This class syntax looks familiar. So I had to change this over to this so that it's an actual React component and not just a function. Because a function, the functional component works well for something very simple, but when you want to have any sort of behavior attached to it, it's better to use an actual component. So I changed it over to this syntax. And what that means is, as I said, React.component documentation is valid. So if I look over here, one thing that it does provide me with, let me check here. Is it has a force update method that exists on my component. It says, by default, when your component state or props change, your component will re-render. So let's go back and look real fast. All right, did this component's state or props change when I did notes dot push. Well, this one didn't. If anything, it would be this one, but since I didn't recall my render function again, this one's props didn't change. And that's why we're not actually rendering. But I can force it to re-render this my app component by calling force update. So let's try that and let's see if this works. I honestly don't know. Haven't tested this out yet. So since I'm inside of a method on my class, I can call this dot force update for my component. Now let's see if this is going to work. So now I'm hoping, oh, it's going to blow up. Cannot read property force update of undefined. At add note. Oh, I know why. Oh, this is an awkward aspect of React classes. I'm going to have to introduce something here. Ask you to sort of ignore it for the time being. Super props, all right. Get my syntax right. That's the right way to do it. Let's see if that works. Nope. All right, hold on. Okay, that's the way to write it. You can see me using this reference very heavily myself, right? I don't remember all the syntax all the time. So I'm having to check and make sure that I'm writing something the correct way. Oh, come on, this should be right now. Let me try and refresh this entirely. Okay, there we go. Yeah, it was just out of sync. So now we can see that it is adding them or re-rendering them. So let's, for a moment, ignore this constructor stuff. But basically what I did was I just told it, go ahead and force yourself to update. And what that means is force it to run this render. And since I have been changing the actual notes object, it does re-render with the new information each time. We'll come back and talk about that constructor bit in just a moment. But does the idea of telling it to force update maybe makes sense, a little confusing? So that was me trying to say, like, you don't have to have added state into this object or this component to accomplish what they're trying to do. That state can still exist external to it, even if but it has access to it, right? That looks a lot like that add to foo. Oops, that's not right. That's a lot like that add to foo syntax we had, where foo was some external state, and then a method that referenced that external state. Well, here's our component. And notes is this external state. It exists here, but it references it. And then the key thing was just making sure that React knows to re-render when we change those values, because it doesn't know by default that it should render again. But if you want to have it know by default, that's where state comes in handy. Because if, like, right now it doesn't know. We can add notes, but it doesn't know to render again without us telling it to do something. So how can we, instead of having to say force update, have React know whenever these values change, you should update and re-render? And that's where using this state capability makes sense. So I'm going to steal some of their code here, their constructor, and then we'll talk about this constructor a little more because we haven't really discussed what's going on there. Because constructors are much more common in other programming languages. They're sort of new to the idea of JavaScript. And so I don't think I even introduced their concept in our last class, really. Oops, this sort of needs to be there. So what a constructor is when you create this object, essentially. In a lot of other programming languages, there's the idea of a class, and that's what we're calling this here now in JavaScript, which is sort of a blueprint for creating objects. You can think of it like, you know, if you're thinking of literally a blueprint for a house, that's a way to create house objects that all look the same. A class is a blueprint for creating objects as well. And in most other programming languages that use object orientation, that's the way that you create objects. You say, here's a class, and then I want to create a new instance of this, of some kind. And when you do that, it calls the constructor method automatically as you're creating an object off of that class and runs this. We'll skip over this line for the time being, come back and talk about it later so that we can try and, I mean, I know we've talked about the idea of inheritance before, but this is tied to inheritance and calling the parent object's properties. But this should look not too bad, right? Okay, so we're setting some stuff on a state property on our object, this dot state, and we're gonna add the notes in here now. So that means we shouldn't need these ones up here, although I haven't finished all of my other code yet, so I'm going to hold on to it for just a moment. Because instead, we're setting them on a state property on our app object that we're creating, our app component. And we're just doing that in constructor, which means when it creates this app component or an instance of this app component, create this state with it. So I'm going to, all right, in the render then, what I want to do is change this so that I use this state instead of what I used before. And there's something a little nice about my syntax here is I just said notes equals notes in sort of fashion referencing this notes up here. So maybe I don't want to change any of that code because I really don't need to. So instead right here, I'll just say let notes equal this dot state dot notes. And then delete all of this up here. And I think there may be some issues. I know why, because of my my other stuff, 31.7 and 32 point. All right, so it's these lines here. So I'm going to comment these out for the moment. But now what we've done is move that state. Property notes of null. Come on. There we go. We've moved that state inside of our object as opposed to being outside of it. But we've got some issues here. Okay, well, I had this force update. I'm going to get rid of all this stuff. I don't want any of that. Clean up my stuff there. And okay, well, that function's still being called, but we're not seeing anything new. However, the state is now part of this React object. And React has essentially two major ways to hold on to values in an object. React has props on any given object, and React has state. So React components have these two things, and they behave a little differently. Props are intended to be static, so you don't change the value. You pass the props in, and you can't change them on that call to that object. If you call render again or something like that, you can pass in new props if you recreate it, but you can't modify their values. And I'll just show this. That's critical. So props acts a lot like the arguments to a function in a sense. Pass them in and it runs through them, but each time you call the function, you pass in a new set of values. State can change. So state can change over time. And if state changes, then it re-renders. Re-renders when changed. So these are sort of the two ways. Was there a question? React objects can have some sort of values on them, other than stuff that you define directly on your component.
Jared, I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you say, so you call render again when you get a state change, what happens if you, let's say you wanted to pop 5 nodes on at a time, so you're adding them, you're changing your state one, you're pushing one at a time. Do you get call render 5 times then, or is it kind of cache those up and just call render once at the end of the function or something?
So it depends. You can do a lot of different optimizations. Like if we went back to the way that we had it just a moment ago, where we were, adding them to this object outside of the React component, the notes array, we would obviously be in control. So we could say like, ooh, add all 5 of these and re-render. Or we could have extra logic in here that would have said, if like maybe we stored an extra value up there, like notes old length or something, and as long as our length isn't so different from what it was before, don't re-render. But once we've reached a big enough difference, go ahead and re-render. Right? So maybe it's a performance thing. Oh man, these things can get added so fast. I only want to re-render so frequently. And that's one benefit of managing the state external to your component as opposed to as a state property on it. Because when it's a state property on it, you can sort of tell React when to re-render, but it's a little more complex. And I can show that too. But now that so let's work through this and then I might be able to show that, I think. So now we've added state, if you will. We've moved these into the state. Now we want to be able to change the values or modify this state when somebody clicks the button, right? Because that's the thing that we had just a moment ago, but we don't have with this new version. And so the way that you do that in a React component like this, their syntax is I'm going to ignore some of that syntax right there for the time being. But one of the keys here is you can't just, like you might think Okay, we have our add note function. We already have it down here. Let's go ahead and make sure that it's set up correctly in the constructor. Again, I'm going to say for the time being, don't worry about what this bind line is. We'll talk more about this because it will be important. But it's perhaps one of the most confusing aspects of JavaScript in the way that this works. And so this is, right now, just consider this a piece of magic that you need when you're writing a React component and you want to add methods to it that correctly work. You need to write this line for each one of them. We don't have to do it for render because React already knows that that's there. But if we're adding additional methods onto our component, we need to have this sort of magic line to tell it basically work the way you would expect up inside of our constructor. So that I can focus on just the stuff I care about right now, I'll collapse some of these other bits in my editor. I don't know if you guys have noticed that, but there's little tools here to help you collapse stuff that's indented so you can look at just the piece of code that you care about at some point in time. And now we've got our add note that we had before. Well, we have the new note portion pulled out here, which is nice because we don't have to change that. So how do we add this to our state? Well, you might think something like this would make sense. This dot state dot notes dot push new note, right? Because we're already in, say, our render function here getting the state that way, or the notes off of our state that way. Let notes equal this dot state dot notes. So obviously we can get the value that way. So why not write it the same way? So let's see what happens when we do that. If we do that, cannot read property state of undefined at add note. Oh, hold on. I think I need to re-render here. There we go. I think this will. So we see it's calling that add note method, but we're not actually changing what's rendered up here, right? And you might think, but we should be. We're pushing stuff into it. Let's check again. Let's do what we were checking before. Let's see what happens here. Is this dot state dot notes. So let's sort of see how many notes we have at any point in time. Oh, here they just showed up. All right, let's try this. It says the number of notes is 3, 4, 5, 6. Man, I thought I said just a moment ago the way to have React automatically know that stuff should re-render is to use the state. But React still doesn't know to update that, and that's because it doesn't have a hook into that just object constantly monitoring it to see if anything changes. So what we need to do instead is we need to change the state using the setState method. So let's change this. Instead of this dot state dot notes dot push, let's do this dot set state, which is part of a React component. And then what we'll pass in is what we want the new state to sort of look like. Well, we want to add something to our notes. So maybe we can this dot set state. Let's do this. Let's say var notes equals this dot state dot notes, because we know we can read it, right? And we wanted to add something to our notes, this new note, right? So we could say notes dot push new note. So now we should have whatever our old note state was, and now we've added an extra one to it. So now what you do with set state, it's a little quirky is you use the variable or the property name from your old state, like notes, and then you tell it what you want to push into it. So I'm gonna rename this so that we don't have as much naming confusion. New notes. I'll call it new notes here. So this is the new notes array. What we're saying is, in our existing state, the notes part of the state, now give it the value of the new notes. All right, let me refresh this. And now when we click to add a note, we can see that it does show up here every time right away. And it's going ahead and adding the note in. Right? Now, some of that was just some sort of magic, and you may be thinking to yourself again, like, well, why did I need to call this set state as opposed to assigning a note? Or what does this do different than assigning the value to the note? So let's implement something very similar to that. And it's going to look just like what we did before, and there's a reason why I didn't go straight to this example. There's a reason why I showed using, like, say, the force update. Let's say we create something similar instead. We're going to change the syntax a little bit and sort of recreate this ourselves. So let's call ours set note state, adding an extra method here. And it's going to take in the new, whatever our notes are, right? Our new notes, if you will. All right, well, I just added another method to my object here, so I better do my little bit of magic up here that says this dot set note state dot bind this. Just a magic line, don't worry about it right now. So I want to set the note state, and I'm going to imagine instead of this dot set state here, I'm going to call this dot set note state my new note. Right? So what I could do here is this dot state dot notes equals new notes. And we've already seen that that does change our state, but it wasn't updating. It wasn't re-rendering. Does anybody remember how we forced a re-render? This dot force update. So let's try this. Ah, it's giving us an error. It's telling me, oh, you should not be doing this. I don't know if it's going to work or not in the browser. We'll find out. It might error out because of that error. Do not mutate state directly, but it's letting me do it. So essentially, you can now you might be thinking, oh, okay, now it sort of makes sense. That set state method that we're calling, really all it's doing is managing the state like this directly and then calling a force update on it after it's changed the state, except they want to control all of that instead of having you directly force the update. And there's some reasons why React wants to manage that instead of you, and that includes some efficiency reasons, because you were asking about, like, what if I wanted to add 5 items or something? Over time, React actually, right now they pretty much update almost every time you change the state, but over time they're adding in additional logic that is attempting to be really smart, that says, like, oh, you're doing a whole bunch of state changes all really fast. Like, we're going to render all those at once and only really change the state once and force a render one time, as opposed to rendering every single time. And so by wrapping it in sort of that set state function call, they're able to add all of this extra logic around it, as opposed to having it, more basic. You have a question? No, you're looking a little inquisitive about that. No.
No, it was instruction, so.
Does that make a little bit of sense? A little confusing, but sort of makes sense. What? So now I'll get rid of my version of it. And we'll go back to calling set state directly the way that they want you to. And that gets us, that should get us back. So we're all happy. It's not yelling at me anymore. Uh-oh. Oh, I'm still binding my method I deleted. So let's get rid of this line. Re-render. We should be all happy and we can update. Now I just used a little bit of a different syntax than they did. And you'll see they even have a note here telling you about the difference between them. Right? We did push. They prefer to use this concat syntax for adding it on. And there is a difference between the two, which for the most part doesn't matter right now to you guys. But I can really quick idea of what the difference is let's say I have two arrays, right? Foo equals 1, 2, 1. Let's do it out of order, or 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to assign bar to foo right now. So they should point to the same thing. So if I did bar equals 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 foo, it should tell me that's true because they're the same object. And now if I did foo dot push and I add something else into it, if I look at foo and I look at bar, I can see that they're the same thing. And if I say bar equals equals foo, sure enough, it's the same, right? Because they're pointing to the same object. And what happened there is it changed the object that they're pointing at, right? It modified it. The only difference between the push and concat, and there is a difference, a fundamental difference, but it doesn't make a huge deal with what we're doing right now. Is let's rename those. Let's create it again. Foo equals, or let's use new ones. Array 1 equals 1, 2, 3. R2 equals R1. So those are the exact same thing right now. And now let's do, and this isn't even going to work. We've got concat 5. So now if we look at array 1, we can see, oh, wait a minute. What happened? Where'd 5 go? We saw output here, but where is it here? And the difference between concat and push is push modifies that object directly, but concat creates a new array and returns it instead. So if I did like R2 equals R1 dot concat 5, then array 2 is this, but array 1 is still the original object. So you're not changing your object when you do concat, you're returning a new object instead. And that does matter when you get into functional programming concepts. It gets back to that concept of like the number on a class changing and being able to change a function, right? Like if you change an object live, it can change your results, whereas returning new ones doesn't. But for now, it doesn't make a huge difference between them. You can read more about that because he's got, you know, this note here about the different ways to write it. It's useful to look at, useful to learn, really useful as you dig more into programming to understand the difference between them. Things that mutate an object versus ones that return a new object. But right now, it didn't make a big difference one way or another. So are there any other questions on this sort of chapter, this section? Want me to go over any of that again? Extra clarity? If not, I think I'm going to take a moment and try and, I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try and toy with Aris's question of being able to only update occasionally. I'm going to see if I can answer that for you. So this will be a lot more complex and stepping beyond what you guys probably will even do in this class at all, but be sort of a fun little item. I want to give a chance for any other questions around this or anything you want me to go over again, still not clear on. All right, I'm going to try and let's see what we can do here. So you're asking about, can you not update all the time or update only occasionally? So there's some component lifecycle methods that exist here, like this, that determine updating for a React component. When should it update? And some of these are just when things are going to happen. So like component will receive props gets called before the component renders, when it's getting new props, when it's re-rendering with properties. Should component update is called right before it decides to render. And it decides whether or not it should actually update and re-render. Component will update is something that's called saying like, oh, are you going to update or not based off some things? And did update is called after it's already rendered. So if we look at components should update, it says what it takes are the next props and the next state as its parameters. And you can look at this and decide, should I update or not? Use should component update to let React know if a component's output is not affected by the current change in state or props. The default behavior is to re-render on every state change, and in the vast majority of cases, you should rely on the default. So I'm gonna try here versus doing it every 5. I'll do it every 2 because it lets me be lazier. I can do 5, and so let's say I only want to re-render every other time that somebody adds a to-do item in. So what I'll do here is this gets next props and next state, and they'll have an example, I'm pretty sure. Oh, they don't have one right here. I have examples somewhere, but maybe not in here. That's one thing I don't love about the React documentation is I feel like you end up having to look a lot of other places to get all of the best documentation for it. But this is the signature, so let's go ahead and take this. Let's add a component should update. Let's add this in here, or should component update. Now, because this is one of the predefined React properties on my object, I don't have to do that component update bind up above. Since it's already one of the methods on it, it should work. And what I'll do is I will check if let me put some comments first. What do I want to do? I want to say if I don't know. I may end up having to hold on to something extra here. So I know how many I currently have, but I don't know what I last rendered it with. I don't know. I may have to do something else here. Because what I want to do is hold on to you know what I'll do is I'm going to add something in this add note section here. So I'm going to say there's another part of my state that I'm going to have here besides just notes. I'm going to add another portion of my state. It's just notes since last render. And I'm going to set it at 0 initially. And now on my state here, I'm going to go ahead and modify this value as well. So I'm not just going to this object that I'm modifying here. I'm going to pass in notes, but I'm also going to change. Oops. Oh yeah, that's gonna work. Notes since last render. I'm gonna do this dot state dot notes since last render. I'm gonna need to add one to it first. So now I'm going to change this note here. So I know that that works. All right. So right now I'm not doing anything in should component update. So it shouldn't affect my application. Let me do a full re-render just to make sure everything's going to be fine. Oh, returned undefined. So I need to return something from this. So I should return true by default. Tell it, go ahead and update, right? Let's just make that a valid function. And it's telling me the number of notes since the last render is going up, but that's because I'm not clearing that value in any way. But at least that's incrementing. So now I feel good there. So now I can check, right, maybe if this dot notes since last render is greater than 1. So if more than one note has been added since the last render, then I'm going to want to re-render. So I'm going to want to return true. But one important thing to do is, and this may yell at me because maybe I'm not supposed to do this, but I also want to change my state again. I want to reset my notes since last render. I didn't like that. Let's reset that. It might yell at me. Otherwise, I want to return false. And just to make sure that this is all working the way I expect, I'm going to put some logs in here, right? Oh, I've got these backwards. I want this to return false and this to return true. Oh, no, that was right. See, now you guys get to see me fumble around a little bit. Console.log. Has been added. Not re-render yet. So let's see. That is a lot of code I just added before I test it, right? To me, at least, I try and add very little code and test. I just put a whole bunch of code in, which means it's probably going to break in some way. So let's see what happens here. Sure enough, notes cannot read property notes since last render of undefined. Probably have. Oh, this dot next state. That's not right. It's next state. So let me refresh this whole thing just in case. Let's see what happens. Oh, do not re-render yet? Hey! Uh-oh, I have some bug there. See, it's rendering every time now. So I need to fix whatever that bug is, but it worked the first time. So yeah, you can put some extra logic around it if you want to control some of that when you want components to update. And so there's a lot of these life cycle functions that exist that let you say, take some certain actions or manipulate things at different points, or component did mount. An example for people who are interested in when that might be useful, we, in a program we wrote at my job, we use these life cycle functions like should it update, should component update, very heavily in one particular piece of code because it integrates some code from outside of React. And we need that thing to change, but because that code's coming from outside of React and needs to be connected to the browser, we can't let React re-render that component because it'll break this outside code. So we need to it's in our React app, but we need to manage when that redraws so that it doesn't break that code. So we have a lot of logic around this in one little piece of our stuff that says, no, don't redraw, don't break this other stuff, please. You only get a redraw when we know that you're not going to break this other bit of code. That's an example of when you would do something like that, for example. Any other questions on anything? Tutorial, not part of this tutorial? I think I forgot to respond. Daisy asked about having some people come and talk to the class about programming, I believe. Another topic, like software development in general recently, and I think I forgot to respond to that. So we should have somebody showing up in one of our upcoming classes, you know, giving you a different perspective on the industry or something like that. But I'll let you know when that's coming. Post something on Slack. We'll do ask questions on Slack. You know, when they get asked them, I think they're getting rapid answers. Rondell was asking some questions about the fat arrow functions this week, and we had a good conversation around that. If you're working through the tutorial and you're not sure about something, ask a question. Or if you're stuck on anything, your system isn't working, just feel free to ask away. It's the best place to get unstuck in between class sessions. There's nothing else. I'm going to stop the video, and then